It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's an attitude. Have this attitude in yourselves which was also in Christ Jesus, Philippians 2:5. It was a beautiful day in San Diego, and my friend Paul wanted to take me for a ride in his airplane. Being new to Southern California, I decided to see our home territory from a different perspective. We sat in the cockpit as Paul completed his instrument checks. Everything was A-OK, so Paul revved the engines and we headed down the runway. As the plane lifted off, I noticed the nose was higher than the rest of the airplane. I also noticed that while the countryside was truly magnificent, Paul continually watched the instrument panel. Since I am not a pilot, I decided to turn the pleasure ride into a learning experience. All those gadgets. I began, what do they tell you? I notice you keep looking at that one instrument more than the others. What is it? That's the attitude indicator, he replied. How can a plane have an attitude? In flying, the attitude of the airplane is what we call the position of the aircraft in relation to the horizon. By now my curiosity had been aroused, so I asked him to explain more. When the airplane is climbing, he said, it has a nose-high attitude because the nose of the airplane is pointed above the horizon. So, I jumped in, when the aircraft is diving, you would call that a nose-down attitude. That's right, my instructor continued. Pilots are concerned about attitude of the airplane because that indicates its performance. Now I can understand why the attitude indicator is in such a prominent place on the panel, I replied. Paul, sensing I was an eager student, continued, since the performance of the airplane depends on its attitude, it is necessary to change the attitude in order to change the performance. He demonstrated this by bringing the aircraft into a nose-high attitude. Sure enough, the plane began to climb and speed decreased. He changed the attitude, and that changed the performance. Paul concluded the lesson by saying, since the attitude of the airplane determines its performance, instructors now teach attitude flying. That conversation triggered my thinking concerning people's attitudes. Doesn't an individual's attitude dictate his performance? Does he have an attitude indicator that continually evaluates his perspective and achievements in life? What happens when the attitude is dictating undesirable results? How can the attitude be changed? And, if the attitude changes, what are the ramifications to other people around him? My friend Paul had an instructor's manual on attitude flying, the relationship between the aircraft's attitude and its performance. We, too, have been given a handbook to attitude living, the Bible. The Apostle Paul, when writing to the church at Philippi, placed before those Christians an attitude indicator. Have this attitude in yourselves which was also in Christ Jesus, Philippians 2:5. Christ gives us a perfect example to follow. His high standard was not given to frustrate us but to reveal areas in our lives that need improvement. Whenever I study Philippians 2:3-8, I am reminded of the healthy attitude qualities that Jesus possessed. He was selfless. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind let each of you regard one another as more important than himself. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others, verses 3 and 4. He was secure. Who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bond-servant, and being made in the likeness of men, verses 6 and 7. He was submissive. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, verse 8. Paul says that these qualities were exhibited in the life of Christ because of his attitude, verse 5. He also says that we can have this same attitude in our lives. We have a visual example of a Christian attitude and we are also encouraged to attain it. Paul states in Romans 12:1 and 2. I urge you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed, how? by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect, emphasis mine. The result of a renewed mind or a changed attitude is to prove and fulfill God's will. Again we see that the attitude dictates performance. I once preached a message from Psalm 34 entitled, How to Face Fear. David was lonely, fearful and frustrated in a cave surrounded by the enemy when he wrote this comforting message. The opening of the chapter enables the reader to see the reason for David's success even when surrounded by problems. David's threefold process of praise. 1. Praise begins with the will, verse 1. I will bless the Lord at all times, his praise shall continually be in my mouth. His attitude reflects a determination to rejoice regardless of the situation. 2. Praise flows to the emotion, verse 2. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. Now David is praising the Lord not only because it's right but also because he feels like it. 3. Praise spreads to others, verses 2 and 3. The humble shall hear it and rejoice. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. David demonstrates that the desired performance, praise, begins with an attitude that is determined to do it. The conclusion of the chapter records David's triumphant, the Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. Attitude living, like attitude flying, says, my attitude dictates my performance. That canopy represents a lot of ground to cover in one book. We'll need to examine, what is an attitude, and why is it important? What are the necessary ingredients for a high-performance attitude? What causes an attitude to become negative, disappointing? How can a wrong attitude that is working against us be turned around to work for us? Along the way we will discover the attitude indicators revealed in persons described in the Bible, the best handbook on attitude performance available since God himself gave it to us. Obviously, this book will not be the last word on this critical subject. But I hope it will be an enlightening word to those who understand the importance of the attitude. I pray it will be helpful to those who want to change. Attitude application. Take a few minutes before proceeding and ask yourself the following questions. Have I checked my attitude lately? How would I rate my attitude? Never been better. Never been worse. Nose high. Nose down. What is an attitude indicator, something which reflects my perspective, in my life?